It was the kind of morning Boston hadn't seen in years. Cold, gray, and endlessly quiet. The city moved on as if nothing had happened. Cars passed, horns echoed, life went on. But on the hill overlooking Whitmore Lake, something final was taking place, something no one cared to witness. The rain fell in steady rhythm against an open casket, a billionaire's casket. Charles Whitmore, a man once hailed as America's builder, the real estate mogul who shaped skylines and rewrote fortunes. He had it all. Towers named after him, foundations built in his honor, even streets carrying his name. Yet today, those same streets led no one here. The priest waited, the news crews waited, but the crowd never came. Not one family member, not a friend, not a single employee from the empire he created. Only the sound of the wind through the trees and the distant clicking of a camera, recording a funeral with no mourners. For 30 minutes, the world's richest grave remained untouched. Then, just as the priest began to close the service, a figure appeared in the distance. A woman, young, drenched in rain, walking slowly down the narrow path. Her helms trembled as she clutched something to her chest, a letter. She stopped beside the coffin, her eyes fixed on the name carved into the marble, Charles E. Whitmore, 1948-2024. Her lips quivered, but she said nothing. She just stood there, silent, respectful, as though she knew secrets no one else dared to speak. The cameras turned. The reporters whispered. Who was she? Why now? And then the priest noticed the seal on the envelope, the same crest used on Whitmore Industries' private letters. She didn't flinch under the flashes. She didn't look at anyone. She simply whispered, barely audible through the storm. He asked me to bring this after he was gone. The letter, old, yellowed, hand-signed by Charles himself, seemed out of place in her shaking hands. No one moved, not even the priest. And as the first shovel of dirt hit the polished lid, that envelope remained sealed, the last message from a man who died surrounded by everything except love. What was written in that letter? Why did he choose her, a nurse he'd only known for weeks? And why, out of the millions of people he'd touched, was she the only one standing there that day? No one could answer then, but behind the quiet and the rain, one truth waited to be uncovered. A truth that would rewrite everything the world thought it knew about Charles Whitmore. Because this wasn't just a funeral. It was the beginning of a revelation 30 years in the making. Charles Whitmore was 70 years old when the world began to forget his name. The man who once commanded boardrooms and broke ground on billion-dollar towers now spent his final months inside a quiet Boston penthouse, surrounded not by family, but by machines and silence. Born in Austin, Texas, Charles had built his empire the hard way, from dust, from oil, from risk. He was the kind of man who never slept until every deal was closed, every rival outplayed. To the world, he was a legend, ruthless, brilliant, unstoppable. But inside, he was something else entirely, a man running from his own reflection. He lost Evelyn, his wife, 30 years ago. The accident was called unfortunate, but to Charles, it was unforgivable. One rainy night, one business call, one missed dinner, and she was gone. The newspapers wrote about his donations to road safety foundations, but what they never wrote was how he blamed himself every day after she left. When his son Michael grew up, he inherited the empire's name, but not his father's heart. Greed split them apart. Michael saw his father as a tyrant, a man who built an empire out of fear instead of love. Charles saw his son as a mirror of everything he once was, proud, cold, and unreachable. So, When his health began to fail and the doctors spoke in whispers of months, not years, the only person by his bedside wasn't family. It was a nurse, Lena Moore. She was 28, from Columbus, Ohio, a small-town girl who'd never seen a city skyline until she moved to Boston. She'd grown up with her grandmother, a woman who used to tell stories about powerful men and how they always seemed to lose the one thing money couldn't buy: peace. To her, Charles Whitmore wasn't a billionaire. He was just another old man trying to remember how to breathe without regret. He didn't speak much at first, but over time, their conversations stretched from medical charts to memories, the kind he never shared with anyone else. Sometimes he'd stare out at the skyline from his glass window and say softly, "You remind me of someone I once loved before the money changed everything." She would smile politely, thinking he was lost in old memories, but the truth was, there was something hauntingly familiar about her face. The way she smiled, the way she listened, even the tone of her voice. To Charles, she wasn't just a nurse, she was a ghost of what he'd lost, a reflection of Evelyn in her gentleness, her warmth, her quiet strength. And as the weeks went by, the walls around his heart began to crumble. He told her stories no one had ever heard about his first investment, the betrayal of his business partner, the night he signed away his marriage for a merger. She listened, not as an employee, but as someone who cared. She didn't judge, she didn't pity him, she just listened. And sometimes, when the pain became too much, she'd hold his hand and whisper, "You're still human, Mr. Whitmore. You just forgot how to be one for a while." For the first time in decades, Charles Whitmore smiled. Not the cold, polished smile for cameras, but a real one. But what Lena didn't know was that the man she was caring for had written a letter, a single letter, locked away in his study, waiting for her name. He never told her what it contained. He never told anyone. But in the final week before his death, he made one last request, that the letter be delivered only when he was gone. Now, as she stood at his grave under the rain, the same letter trembled in her hands, her name written in his shaky handwriting. What did he leave behind for her? A confession? A gift? Or something that would change her life forever?
One thing was certain. Charles Whitmore's story didn't end with his death. It began with her discovery. And somewhere between the ink and the silence of that letter waited a truth he'd spent a lifetime trying to bury. Charles Whitmore's death was supposed to end a story. Instead, it ignited a storm. Within hours of his passing, Boston's financial district buzzed with whispers. Reporters flooded the gates of Whitmore Industries. Investors called emergency meetings. And across the nation, headlines screamed, "The empire without an heir." His son, Michael Whitmore, was quick to appear on screens, dressed in black, emotionless, demanding access to his father's will. But the lawyers hesitated because there wasn't just one, there were two. The first, a public will, had been filed years ago, leaving everything to the Whitmore Foundation. The second, rumored but never found, could change everything. Behind closed doors, panic spread like fire. If the second will existed, who had it? And why had Charles chosen to keep it hidden? Days before his death, Lena had noticed something strange. Charles's assistant had delivered a thick envelope sealed with his family crest, but instead of handing it over to the lawyers, he'd pressed it into her hands with trembling fingers. "Only after I'm gone," he'd whispered. "Promise me, Lena." She had promised. But now, standing in her small apartment after the funeral, the letter sat on the table like it was alive, waiting. Her heart raced as she stared at his handwriting. She shouldn't open it. It might belong to his family. But something inside her told her it wasn't meant for them. The rain tapped gently against her window, the same sound she'd heard at his funeral. She broke the seal. Inside was no will, no list of properties or fortunes, just a confession, written in ink, trembling and raw. If you're reading this, it means I never got the chance to tell you the truth. Years ago, long before the world knew my name, I was in Ohio. I had nothing, no company, no fortune. There was a storm. My car had crashed. A woman pulled me from the wreck and nursed me back to life. Her name was Margaret Moore, your grandmother. Lena's breath caught. She asked for nothing in return. I promised I would take care of her family, but I didn't. I became too rich, too proud, too lost. When I met you, I saw her kindness again, and I realized what I had failed to do. That's why you were chosen, Lena. That's why I trusted you. You were the only part of my life that still felt human. Tears blurred the ink as she turned the final page. But there was more. A second, smaller envelope inside, her name alone, for Lena. Her hands trembled as she opened it. You deserve to know the rest. Your mother, Anna, was my daughter. I kept her hidden, afraid of what my name would do to her. When she died, I told myself it was mercy to let her rest in peace without the Whitmore curse. But the truth is, it was cowardice. I left you in a world I created, a world that worshipped power and forgot love. She froze. The room spun. Her patient was her grandfather. The man she'd cared for, the man she'd pitied, the man she thought was just a lonely billionaire, was family. Every memory of him came rushing back. The way he smiled when she hummed, the way he stared at her like he'd known her forever, the way his voice cracked when he said, "You remind me of someone I once loved." It wasn't Evelyn he had seen in her. It was Anna, her mother. Outside, thunder rumbled again, and in that moment, Lena realized the empire the world envied was built on buried secrets. The public would remember Charles Whitmore as the billionaire who died alone. But she knew better. He hadn't died alone. He had died forgiven. Still, one question remained. If she was his blood, if she was the true heir, what would happen when the world found out? Because somewhere in that city, Michael Whitmore was already digging for the second will. And when he learned who really stood in his way, his half-sister, the empire his father built would face its final war. And this time, it wouldn't be about money. It would be about truth. The rain stopped, but only after she read the first line of the letter. For a moment, everything was still. The city lights outside her window blurred into streaks of gold and gray. Lena sat frozen in the pages, trembling in her hands, her heartbeat echoing louder than the thunder had hours ago. Her grandfather, Charles Whitmore. The words replayed in her mind like an echo she couldn't silence. But with every line she read, more questions surfaced. Questions that didn't fit the story she'd been told. Why had he hidden this for so long? Why had he written a second will, and who was it really meant for? She searched the letter again, looking for answers. Then, buried beneath the pages, she noticed something faint, a line of handwriting pressed hard enough to leave an impression on the paper below. She held it to the light. It was an address. Whitmore Trust Vault, Cambridge Bank, 4th floor, private access. Her pulse quickened. The second will, it had to be there. The next morning, she typed his name into her phone, scrolling through decades of headlines, until one photograph stopped her cold. a black and white image from a 1980 charity gala. Charles Whitmore stood smiling beside a young woman. Same eyes, same hair. Her mother. She dropped the phone. The photo's caption read, "Charles Whitmore and longtime associate Anna Moore." The world had thought Anna Moore was just a secretary, but the truth was written across their faces. The closeness, the comfort, the familiarity. Lena's world tilted. Everything she'd known, her mother's past, her family's silence, it all led back to him. She grabbed her coat and ran through the streets of Boston, the letter tucked under her arm. She needed to find someone who could confirm it, someone who had known him in those years. But as she approached the cemetery one last time, hoping for clarity, she froze. Someone was standing by his grave. A tall man in a black coat turned slowly toward her. "Miss Moore," he said, voice low but calm. "I'm Daniel Reeves, Mr. Whitmore's lawyer. We need to talk." Her stomach nodded. "About what?" He hesitated. "About a document that's gone missing." She frowned. "Missing?" "The private letter Charles left in his vault. It's not there anymore." Lena's breath caught. That can't be true, because she was holding it right there in her purse. The lawyer studied her expression for a long moment, as though reading her thoughts. Then he added softly, "Someone broke into the vault last night. Whoever took it knew exactly what they were looking for." The wind picked up, scattering loose petals across the grave. The name Charles E. Whitmore gleamed under the morning light, silent, final, unyielding. And yet somewhere beneath the marble and the secrets, a new story was beginning. Because that missing letter, the one that could destroy the Whitmore empire, wasn't lost. It was in the hands of the one person no one expected, Lena Moore, the hidden heir. But what she didn't know yet was that someone else already knew her secret, and they were watching her, even now.
The gates of the Whitmore mansion opened slowly, their iron hinges crying out like old ghosts disturbed. Lena stepped into a silence so deep it felt alive. Dust drifted in the air, glimmering in weak sunlight that fought its way through the tall windows. Everything inside seemed frozen in time. Grand chandeliers draped in cobwebs, velvet curtains faded to gray, portraits staring down from the walls with judging eyes. She walked through the long corridor, her shoes echoing against the marble floor. Each step seemed to carry her deeper into the world Charles Whitmore had built and destroyed with his own hands. His empire was here, the gold frames, the marble statues, but none of it felt like home. It was a museum of regret. Then she saw it. A large portrait above the staircase, a woman in a flowing white dress, smiling softly. Evelyn Whitmore. Around her neck hung a delicate golden locket, shaped like a teardrop. Lena's breath caught. It was the same locket her mother had worn every day of her life, the one she said was a gift from someone who once loved her but couldn't stay. Her hand trembled as she reached into her pocket and unfolded the letter, the final one Charles had written. His words were shaky, uneven, but heavy with truth. "I have no right to ask for forgiveness," it began. "I failed your mother when she needed me most. I hid behind wealth and pride, believing that love could wait until my empire was safe. But by the time I looked back, the years had already buried everything I cared about. You were the promise I broke, Lena. And if I could rewrite my life, I would start by keeping it." Tears blurred her vision. For the first time, the loneliness she had felt all her life made sense. Every unanswered question, every story her grandmother refused to finish, it was all here in his confession. She whispered softly, "He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was begging for redemption through me." The room felt different now. The air no longer cold, just still. She walked toward the grand hall where the coffin rested. The glass ceiling above reflected the last light of the evening, warm and golden. She knelt beside the coffin, laid the letter gently over the roses, and spoke in a trembling voice. "You kept your promise, Grandpa, even if it came too late." The silence that followed was almost peaceful. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, and for a brief moment, a beam of sunlight touched the coffin lid. She stood, ready to leave, but something caught her eye, a small glint beneath the coffin. She knelt again and found a tiny golden key, its edges engraved with two simple words, "For you." She stared at it for a long time, her heartbeat slowing, her tears dropping. Then she looked up, and for the first time since he died, she smiled. Maybe the story wasn't over yet. Lena stood at the mansion's doorway with the golden key in her hand. The evening sun slipped through the broken windows, lighting the empty hall in shades of gold and gray. Every inch of the house spoke of wealth, yet it felt hollow. She could almost hear his voice in the silence, a tired whisper of a man who had gained the world but lost his soul. For a long moment, she stood still. Then she understood. Charles Whitmore had built towers that touched the clouds, but none that could reach forgiveness. She whispered softly, "You showed me what money could never buy: time, love, and peace." The wind blew gently through the open doors. Outside, the rain had stopped, and sunlight broke through the clouds, turning the wet ground into silver. Lena slipped the key into her pocket, not as a sign of inheritance, but as a promise to live differently. She walked away from the mansion. Behind her, the Whitmore estate stood silent, a monument to lessons learned too late. Some stories end with loss, others end with love. Hers ended with understanding. Charles Whitmore's final gift was not the fortune he left behind, but the truth he could no longer hide. Money can build kingdoms, but it can never rebuild the heart it broke. Lena's voice lingered softly in the quiet. Every story of power hides a lesson in pain. Every fortune has a price, and sometimes love is the only treasure worth finding. The camera drifts across the quiet Whitmore mansion one last time. The golden light of sunset rests on its walls, now empty but peaceful. Lena walks slowly down the gravel path, her letter pressed to her chest, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The sound of her footsteps fades into the wind. Would you forgive the person who abandoned your family if their last wish was to make things right? Sometimes the richest people leave behind more than money. They leave unfinished stories, unanswered letters, and hearts still waiting to heal. If this story touched your heart, leave a broken heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories where wealth meets humanity. Because in the end, forgiveness is the only fortune worth keeping.